Our devotion today is from Isaiah chapter 43. Before we look at it, I want to remind you today to be in prayer for the Lehman family. That is Sean and Corey and Micah and Isaiah. So, Isaiah chapter 43, it's a love letter. You know, that's the feeling I got from this as I was reading through it. God is pouring out his heart to his people. It's well established by this point. God's judging his people. He's punishing them. He's taking them into captivity, and he is redeeming them. And the message of this chapter is, I'm doing all this because I love you, because you're my people. It's verses like verse 4 where it says, because you're precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. God is pouring out his heart to his people here. Unfortunately, as you read through it, you get the idea that it's sort of a one-sided love letter here in this chapter. He gets to the end and he talks about how he's loved them, but they haven't really loved him back. In fact, they've lost their love for him a long time ago. Verse 22, he says, yet you did not call upon me, O Jacob, but you have been weary of me, Israel. You have not brought me your sheep or burnt offerings, or honored me with your sacrifices. I have not burdened you with offerings, or wearied you with frankincense. He says, I've done everything for you, and you've gotten bored of me. You've wearied of me. You've given your love away to other gods who aren't really gods. And of course, this evokes to us the idea that God loved us even while we were sinners, even as we were enemies of God. God's love didn't fail. He was faithful even when we were unfaithful. And that's what he did for Israel. His love for them wasn't based on them. It wouldn't have lasted long if it was. God is saying to them, I still love you. I still love you even though you've turned away from me. The passage here that stood out to me the most starts at verse 16. He says, thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters? Who brings forth chariot and horse, army and warrior? They lie down, they cannot rise. They are extinguished, quenched like a wick. What's he talking about there? Well, I think when we read that, if we're familiar with the story, it brings back that story of God delivering the Israelites away from Egypt through the Red Sea, and he parted the Red Sea and the Egyptians were crushed. And we know that this obviously would have been familiar to the Jewish people. It's the story really of the birth of their nation, where God delivered them out of bondage and gave them the land that he had promised to Abraham, and he fulfilled everything to them and saved them from what seemed like an impossible situation. Against all odds, God delivered them out of the hands of death. It was what they looked back to, right? You know, they looked back to Moses and him receiving the law and all that. He goes on and he says, remember not the former things, nor consider the old things. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. He takes their mind back to his salvation at Egypt, which really made them a people. And he says, I'm doing something new, something that is beyond that. I'm saving you. And he's referring to how he's going to save them out of Babylon. I'm making a way for you in the wilderness and putting rivers out here in the desert. I'm providing life where there's death. And just like Pastor Mike talked about how, to be intentional, to see Christ in these messages, I think this is what God is referring to here. His ultimate act of salvation. That he's doing a new thing, a new act of salvation that we can't even comprehend. If we're to look back at how God took his people through the Red Sea, was that an incredible miracle? Absolutely. But it doesn't compare to the salvation that God is bringing. I'm thankful for this passage today. If God spoke something to you out of it, if he revealed something to you about himself or about Christ, I'd ask that you leave us a message. As for me today, it just reminds me how good our God is and how good his salvation is. and reminds me to remember that I can trust in Him, that He's faithful, and I can trust Him with everything that I have. Thank you for taking time to watch this today. God bless you.